So there are a couple of different things. I mean, the median household income in Benton County is much higher than in Washington County. The median household income in Benton County, I think, is about $67,000 or $68,000. Washington County, that number is about $50,000. So there's a discrepancy right there between the two counties that are part of the same region. But within that, obviously, a big factor in that is that there are better paying jobs in Benton County than there are in Washington County. Certainly, Walmart and all of their supplier community has higher paying jobs on average than some of the bigger companies here in Washington County. So that's part of what's driving that. The other part of what does drive some of it, definitely not all of it, is that in Washington County, obviously Fayetteville's the biggest city in Washington County, and a huge chunk of Fayetteville's population is the student population, and their personal incomes are much lower, even though they have access to their family's income to make ends meet while they're in college. But because when they work on campus or they work off campus, their income tends to be very low. That shows up. It contributes to Fayetteville's official poverty rate, or the lower median income in Fayetteville, and it contributes to the lower median income in Washington County, because it's about a fourth of Fayetteville's population, maybe about 10-12% of the county's population, so it does drag the overall county's numbers down. That alone doesn't explain all of it. Obviously, there are higher paying jobs in Benton County than there are in Washington County. Educational attainment is higher in Benton County than it is in Washington County, so there's definitely pieces that contribute to a higher median income, which is why there are fewer households that are struggling to make ends meet in Benton County as a percentage than there are in Washington County.
Okay.
But I think there are other measures. So if you look at the number of households that have hunger-related issues, Benton County has the lowest percentage in the entire state. I think it's Phillips County that has the highest percentage in the entire state.
Yeah.
In sheer numbers, the number of people that meet that measure, I think, is double the number in Phillips County, even though the percentage is 6 or 11% in Benton County. I think it's 11% in Benton County and close to 40% in Phillips County. There's still more people in Benton County at that 11% than there are at the 40% in Phillips County. To make a living, so people think if you have a job, most people think that those people don't live in poverty, but that's not actually true, because a lot of jobs don't pay enough to sustain a household. So when you consider the fact that a lot of their money, more than 50% at times, is going towards paying for housing, that usually, when you have a household budget, most people with means are not thinking about this stuff, but you're not competing between different categories of spending, whether or not to pay rent this month, whether to pay the utility bills, whether to put food on the table, which usually ends up being the last thing, as you kind of have to pay the rent more often than not. You kind of have to pay the utility bills more often than not. I mean, they give you a little bit of grace period and fines and so on, but you can carry that for a little bit. And prescription medication, that's another thing that comes up that people have to pay for out of pocket. And so then usually at the end of the day, the least amount of money available tends to be for food, and that's where you have issues around hunger. So, people often talk about these different issues as being separate, but they're not. I mean, at the end of the day, it all comes down to one issue, is that the household does not have enough money to meet all of its needs. And I think that's really what this report tries to say in a very concise fashion, to try to provide a single source of information for all the counties and all the different cities in Arkansas, to show, okay, well, just because your unemployment rate here in Northwest Arkansas might be 2.5% doesn't automatically mean that everybody here is doing well. I mean, I think there are still households living on the edge here in Washington County and Benton County, and definitely across the rest of the state too. And we've seen several of these national surveys that suggest that people don't really have enough savings for a $400 expense. I think that particular survey that got a lot of play last year was from the Federal Reserve. It said, can most households cover a $400 expense without having to borrow it? And some unusually large number, more than 50% of households, I think, said no. I think the caveat there is that the question, the way it was framed, was, would you cover it without borrowing? Now, maybe people have money in some asset
I see what you're
they
saying.
don't want to take out because they'd rather keep that and borrow the $400 as an emergency.
Yeah.
So that's different than saying I simply do not have $400 in any asset that I can immediately get a hold of to pay for an expense. But nonetheless, it goes to show that most middle-income households are not thinking the same way. I mean, they have sort of assets and savings that they don't want to touch. They know are for some purpose, but they still also have some kind of a balance in their checking accounts or some other form of a savings account that they can access to pay for new tires or $400 or $500 expense. But there is a very large population of people that do not have access to that in any form. I think some of our welfare systems discourage people from building those types of assets because they require you to liquidate your own assets, which again creates the same sort of problems in the long run. If you're not allowed to build assets to receive benefits from the state, then it's very hard to have money to fix your tire if something happens to your car, which is your only means of transportation to work.
Yeah.
And the way we've set up our benefit system is the state telling you you cannot save enough money to buy new tires for your car. So I think that is a problem. So I think there's a lot of policy issues that we need to deal with, and it's not in Arkansas this year. It's definitely the way the federal benefit system is set up. There are changes that the state can make too.
Right.
The state has quite a bit of
mitigate it
leeway,
somewhat,
in how they design some of these systems, but especially around the asset tests, I think the state has a lot of leeway there. Other states have definitely done away with some of the asset testing.
Gotcha.
So I would say that the federal government now puts out two measures of poverty. There's the standard measure of poverty, which is just to see how much income your household has, and that number is then used to provide funds for all of these different federal and state safety net programs.
Threshold,
The federal government also now, at least in the last less than 10 years or so, has put out a supplemental measure of poverty that takes into account that yes, your income is this, but then here are all these benefit programs you qualify for, and as a result your overall household income is now X amount higher than the federal poverty threshold because we're giving you, whether that's an earned income tax credit and all these things. So that's a different measure of poverty. These households are still in poverty. They would be in poverty if they didn't get, they would be a lot worse off if they weren't getting those federal safety net benefits. But it gets you an idea of how much the federal safety net is actually going towards sustaining households in the United States. And so if you look at this over time, they've gone back and measured it since the 60s. The overall poverty rate in the United States has not changed one bit. It's roughly the same number of people. It's just a lot more people, not a lot more people, but the same amount of people are roughly
percentage-wise.
Covered by federal safety net programs. If it wasn't for this, we would be worse off today in terms of our poverty rate than we were in the 60s. So the only reason that the overall poverty rate has not gone up in that intervening period is because we've expanded the federal social safety net in the country. So that's one thing. The other thing, just talking about where the poverty line is set for an individual, for a family, compared to most other OECD countries, developed countries, ours is set way lower than all of them. And I think a lot of countries tend to go towards 50 to 60% of the median income in an area, and that's not where we're set. So Arkansas's median income is about $48,000 for a household. 50 to 60% of that is way higher than where the federal poverty line is in Arkansas. So I think if you look at the Alice report and how households are struggling to meet their payments just with what the federal poverty line is, I think getting you to 50 to 60% of the median income for the state gets you closer to being able to live and not just barely survive.
I know what you're saying. Getting back to what I'll call the Alice study. It's coming out right at the cusp of, I don't want to overhype this, but the virus is going to have an impact.
Right.
Okay, what's the likely impact on the people that the Alice study, concentrates upon? I mean, basically, you miss a paycheck and you're in this category of people. You're in a world of hurt, pardon the colloquialism. But yeah, talk about that for a little bit.
I think that is the biggest concern with this virus, if and when it reaches pandemic levels here in the United States, is that once you shut down broad sections of our economy, there are indeed a lot of students here in Washington County, even in Benton County, whose 2, maybe even 3 meals a day come because the school is open. Maybe their meals for the weekend come because they get sent something home on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
All of that disappears
Mm-hmm.
with no easy way to actually substitute that, because the overwhelming problem is that you need to keep people from congregating in places. You have to worry about who's going out and who's preparing food. So how do you even prepare food and deliver it to all of these households without putting the delivery workers and the food workers at risk?
I hadn't thought about
So this
that.
is, we are not prepared for, in the sense that if we were prepared for this, is we would have pre-prepared food that you could send home with
Yeah.
people, and that they would not need to go out and get food. They would not need to have food be delivered to them. We are not prepared for that by any means at all.
Our food distribution
System cannot handle this. The second piece that we're not really addressing, that we're kind of tinkering around the edges, is
Mhm.
that, okay, well, there's some talk about handling bailouts or some form of aid to businesses in the leisure and hospitality business, a lot of service sector businesses that are going to be, at the end of the day, if you lock down cities like they're having to do in Italy right now, nobody's going out to eat, nobody's going out to laundry, nobody's going out to movie theaters. Restaurants are notoriously businesses with really tight margins.
Yep.
The business owner, a restaurant owner, can't continue to pay their employees if people are not walking in through the doors.
Mm-hmm.
Their employees tend to make lower wages in general already.
Mm-hmm.
And the solutions currently being bandied about in Washington, D.C. will not address that at all. People are talking about a 2% payroll tax cut. The key problem there is that people that work hourly, which is most of the service sector economy, if they don't work, they don't get payroll, and they don't get a payroll tax cut. So a 2%
Mhm.
payroll tax cut, helps me, but I'm not the one that's working an hourly job. I get a salary. My expenses are covered regardless of whether I'm quarantined or not. But people that work hourly jobs, if they are not scheduled to work anymore because a restaurant's closed, they're not going to get the 2% payroll tax. It's not going to help them one bit, because they have no payroll to get 2% extra off of. So when we're thinking about designing how we deal with that,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we've even given it the slightest bit of thought yet.
It might be nice to address the actual problem.
Right. And so in this case, this is literally where you would need to send checks to households, which gets around a part of the problem, so they can help, can sustain their rent or whatever it is that they might need during the intervening period when they are quarantined and can't work. But it still doesn't get around the problem that if they're trying to buy food,